We know how to win on the battlefield. Another important task for us is to achieve victories in the economy as well, and to be an attractive country for investors. In June 2022, less than 3 months after Russia lost its offensive in Ukraine, European leaders met in Lugano, Switzerland, to discuss the reconstruction of the country. Ukraine is getting ready for what it calls the largest reconstruction project since World War II, for which it will need hundreds of billions of euros of investment over the course of decades. That money is not only about recovering from the devastation brought by Russia.
Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians trying to get to safety.
A year of war has crippled the country's economy.
But also to get out of a decades-long economic stagnation. So how will Ukraine pay for its reconstruction, and will it ever be able to fund its recovery? To understand if Ukraine's economy can ever be successful, we first have to understand why it was such an underperformer before the war. Despite a highly educated workforce, an abundance of natural resources, an internationally renowned IT industry, and mastery of nuclear energy, Ukraine has struggled to live up to its economic potential. It has faced wide-scale deindustrialization and depopulation, with both a collapse in manufacturing output and a 15% fall in population since 1991. Owing to a low birth rate and immigration to wealthier countries. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's economy became dominated by a corrupt and ineffective economic elite in the form of the oligarchs. And as they competed for political power and it clashed with Ukrainian society, they generated political instability. Together with the legacy of Soviet bureaucracy, investors were scared off and Ukraine's economy failed to grow and diversify. As a result, Ukraine's GDP performance has been abysmal, being nearly 9 times smaller than that of the European Union, but also much smaller than resource-rich Russia or subsidized Belarus, even ahead of the invasion of Ukraine. And that has left Ukraine to have an economy concentrated in 3 economic sectors, accounting for 73% of its exports, all reliant on geography, expensive infrastructure, and access to global markets. The first of these economic sectors is farming. Thanks to a series of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation networks constructed around the Dnieper River in the 1950s, and some of the world's most fertile soil, Ukraine has historically been an agricultural powerhouse. In 2021, its products, which accounted for 9% of the world's wheat, 17% of its barley, and 47% of its sunflower oil, would be shipped from its Black Sea ports to feed the huge population centers of Egypt, Pakistan, or Indonesia. Ukraine has also been blessed with huge amounts of natural resources, sitting on 3 major gas basins, 2 major coal and iron deposits, as well as a bunch of other minerals like lithium or titanium, many of which are useful for the energy transition. Ukraine would then export much of these minerals to the European Union, with iron ore making a whopping 10% of all Ukrainian exports in 2020. But Ukraine would also process some of these resources itself, using the huge industrial potential left over from the Soviet Union, particularly in the resource-rich south and east of the country, which is home to most of its industry, to export steel and aluminium products to the European Union. Ukraine would then use the sale of these raw products to buy more complex goods like cars or computers from the likes of the European Union and China. But the war has seen Russia attempt and partially succeed in sinking the Ukrainian economy, which crashed by a whopping 35% in 2022, on top of which some of Russia's actions have dealt damage that will affect the country's long-term economic potential. First, Russia still occupies 15% of Ukraine, which includes much of its industrial base and some of its most fertile land. Even if Ukraine does reconquer much of that territory, the fighting, shelling, and mining of that very same land will leave it heavily polluted, damaging Ukraine's future agricultural potential. And if it wasn't enough, Russia has dealt irreparable damage to megaprojects that underpin much of Ukraine's industrial and agricultural success. It has shelled Europe's largest nuclear installation, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, blown up the Novokakhovka dam, which irrigated much of southern Ukraine, and flattened the Azovstal steel mills, which before the war produced 1/5 of Ukraine's steel. Repairing these installations would take years and billions of euros in investment to rebuild. On top of this, Russia has both mined the Black Sea and blocked off Ukraine's shipping lanes, effectively locking it out of the global economy. Despite a grain deal with Russia brokered by the UN and Turkey to prevent global unrest and starvation, Ukraine has struggled to export its agricultural products due to continued Russian interference. The Black Sea ports, which accounted for 60% of the country's trade before the invasion, have been almost entirely shut down. And instead, Ukraine has had to rely both on its safer but also much smaller Danube River ports near Romania, which have exported 50% of the grain redirected from the Black Sea ports, and its border with the European Union, where 2 Polish towns have turned into logistical lifelines, allowing military aid and trade to flow to and from Ukraine. And finally, using this very same lifeline, Ukraine has seen an additional exodus, with an estimated 8 million Ukrainians, or 20% of its population, mostly women and children, having left the country since the conflict began, moving mostly to the European Union and the United Kingdom. In the occupied parts of the country, roughly 1 million people have been forcibly displaced by Russia and relocated to the far eastern reaches of Siberia. The combination of lost land, destroyed infrastructure, and displaced population has all contributed to the massive fall of Ukraine's economic output and has left the country essentially dependent on Western grants and loans to stay afloat. And so it should come as no surprise that a mere 3 months after the invasion started, that the Ukrainian government unveiled a plan not only to survive the war and rebuild the country, but to modernize its institutions, join the EU, and tackle Ukraine's long-term weaknesses, like corruption or its oligarch-dominated economy. But on top of the political will, for which there is no shortage, Ukraine, which did a legislative speedrun of the reforms needed to join the EU, will need one important thing to rebuild: cash. And there are huge variations for the amount of money Ukraine will need. According to the World Bank, Ukraine needs an estimated 411 billion euros as of date to rebuild, while Ukraine's own projections reach up to 1 trillion euros. This dwarfs the aid granted by Western countries so far, which has been spent on keeping Ukraine alive and its armies equipped. And future pledges like the 50 billion euros the EU plans to give to Ukraine between 2024 and 2027 are insufficient. That means that the money will have to come from somewhere else. And that brings us all to the trillion-euro question. Where is Ukraine going to get the money it needs to rebuild? The first potential source of money would be to resume what it was doing ahead of the conflict, being a commodities exporter to Europe and the rest of the world, and selling agricultural products, energy, and its vast mineral wealth valued in the trillions. But it could also be facilitated by more integration with both the G7 economies and its largest customer, the European single market. Ukraine could become the major provider of commodities, food products, and minerals to some of the world's wealthiest markets. In fact, this has already somewhat happened, with Ukraine having been granted access to nearly the entirety of the EU market as a wartime measure through the removal of quotas, a move that could repeatedly be extended until Ukraine's eventual accession. And while Ukraine's agricultural products are currently left out of this agreement, were they to be included, they would easily dominate the European market and fetch a higher price. This, however, has the drawback of producing wealth over time and would not allow to finance reconstruction at the speed Ukraine would wish. If Ukraine were to take its integration a step further by joining the European Union in the coming years, it could get parts of the money it needs from the EU budget, with the two likeliest levers being the Common Agricultural Policy and the Cohesion Fund. The first gives money to farmers for managed land, and were Ukraine to join, its mega farms, which are on average 20 times larger than the farms in the EU, would instantly become the largest recipients and trigger heavy political opposition from other European countries and their farmers, who would lose out on subsidies. For the second, the EU's cohesion funds gives out money to regions poorer than the EU average. As an extremely poor country, Ukraine would end up receiving a huge section of that funding, depriving other European countries, including Poland and the Baltics, which have been some of the main recipients of this key EU funding. So while on paper these funding options exist, Ukraine joining would radically change the recipients of the EU's two most important money redistribution policies. And as such, one could expect delays in Ukrainian membership to the European Union, as compromises will need to be struck, leaving it integrated to the EU but not yet a member. The third potential source would be to confiscate the frozen assets from the Russian central bank, amounting to nearly 200 billion euros that are sitting in European banks. But the EU has seen no legal avenue for seizing these funds, and seeing as it would also eliminate one important source of leverage in negotiations with Russia, it's unlikely that this would happen. And so that leaves us with the last option, private funding, which Ukraine considers as the most promising avenue in terms of the amount of funds it will be able to access. In fact, Rostislav Shurma, deputy head of the Ukrainian president's office in charge of economic policy, estimates that 80% of the funds for Ukraine's reconstruction will come from private money. And Ukraine has been looking to make itself pretty to court that private money, undergoing economic liberalization by, for example, slashing collective bargaining power and worker protections. Its energy and natural resource abundance, low labor costs, and skilled workers, alongside its integration into the European market, would make an enticing offer for companies looking to set up factories. But to really convince the private capital essential to its reconstruction to set up shop, Ukraine will need three main things. First, it will need more European integration. Second, it will need a settlement with Russia, which then implies the third element of clearly defined borders. Ukraine's integration within the European Union, its biggest market, will dictate the extent to which building factories in the country is a viable business model, potentially facilitating investments in the future. And while it may take time for Ukraine to join, it currently seems Ukraine will continue to enjoy near complete access to the EU market even before joining. Then it will also be determined by whether or not Ukraine has a peace settlement with Russia, which would make Ukraine a risk-free country for private investment. And finally, it will also depend on the borders Ukraine will find itself in at the end of the war, which will not only determine how many people live in the country, but also the resources it can sell and the price tag of reconstruction. A larger Ukraine in its pre-2014 borders would have more resources to go on, but faces the cost of rebuilding and reintegrating land that has been controlled by Russia for nearly a decade. And that brings us to three scenarios for the reconstruction of the country, ranging from total victory to a forever war. The first scenario is the most optimistic, where Ukraine finds a settlement either through total victory or by finding a peace resolution with Russia. Ukraine either ends up in its post-2014 or pre-2014 borders. This settlement allows Ukraine to integrate with the European Union and reconnect with global markets to fully exploit its potential. The relative safety of the country encourages the refugees that fled to Europe to come back, which makes reconstruction easier. With a peace settlement, companies are eager to invest in the exploitation of natural resources, generating both income for the government and jobs. Using that money, Ukraine is able to rebuild effectively, but still faces an arduous challenge of dealing with its long-term economic challenges, like corruption. The second scenario is where Ukraine also finds a settlement with Russia, but is forced to make some territorial concessions. While this would make reconstruction cheaper, simply because Ukraine would not own the destroyed land, it would also prove more limiting in terms of its access to natural resources and agricultural land that proved to be the backbone of the Ukrainian economy. It would be extremely limiting for Ukraine if it didn't control both banks of the Dnieper River to secure its vital economic artery that would facilitate its access to global markets. In this scenario, Ukraine could be just as, if not more successful than in the first, with a lower price tag on its reconstruction. And finally, the worst-case scenario for Ukraine's recovery is the scenario where the war continues to drag on with Russia, either as a frozen conflict with regular outbursts of fighting, or a hot conflict. Threats on shipping lanes continue to throttle Ukraine's trade with the rest of the world, and Ukraine becomes much more dependent on the European Union. Ukraine finds it hard developing industrial sites like mines, gas fields, or steel mills, which make for easy targets, and companies in general are reluctant to invest in the country out of fear of their assets being destroyed. Ukraine would remain a commodities provider and agricultural country, but struggle to move up the value chain, with most of the processing of the remaining commodities it can export taking place further west, in neighboring Poland or Romania. But for all these scenarios, there remains one huge risk of Ukraine's integration: demographic collapse. Should Ukraine fail to keep up with the economic ambitions of its reconstructions, more Ukrainians could join those that have already sought refuge in other parts of Europe, which are all too keen on attracting the skilled workers that Ukraine's population is made up of. Ukraine could see its resources and people being siphoned off, intentionally or not, by the very same countries that have kept it alive and promised to help it rebuild. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and would like to learn more about Europe's place in the global economy, then watch this video on Europe's deindustrialization as a result of the energy war with Russia, or this one to learn about the economic competitiveness of the European Union. And if you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, feel free to join Into Europe's awesome Patreon supporters who help make this possible.